Young Millionaire thought he was marrying an ugly woman through an arranged marriage. But when she removed her veil, he was shocked by what he saw. Ethan Matthews, a young millionaire, sat back in the leather chair at the head of the dining table in his family's sprawling mansion. The extravagant dinner before him, perfectly cooked steak, fine wine, and meticulously plated sides remained untouched. Cold. His father, Richard Matthews, sipped his wine with a calm demeanor, though his words carried an undeniable weight. His mother, Eleanor, sat upright, her hands neatly folded, her sharp gaze locked on Ethan. "This isn't happening," Ethan said, breaking the tense silence. He pushed his plate aside and leaned back in his chair, his frustration palpable. "You can't be serious. An arranged marriage? What century are we living in? This is not a request, Ethan," Richard replied, his tone steady but firm. "It's a decision, and it has already been made." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his dark hair. "A decision made without me. How thoughtful of you." "Enough with the sarcasm," Eleanor interjected sharply, her voice cutting through the air. "This is not just about you. It's about the family, about preserving what we've built." "The family?" Ethan scoffed, his voice dripping with defiance. "And the way to preserve it is to marry me off like I'm some sort of bargaining chip? To someone I've never even met?" "You'll meet her soon enough," Richard said, setting his glass down with deliberate calm. "Sophia is a respectable young woman from a good family. This arrangement benefits everyone." "Good family?" Ethan sneered, crossing his arms. "Then why does she hide behind a veil? What's she hiding? A scar? A secret identity?" "Don't be cruel," Eleanor snapped, her icy tone silencing him for a moment. "Sophia is a private person, and she has her reasons. She doesn't owe you an explanation." "No, but apparently, I owe her my life," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "Why me? Why not let her marry someone else who's willing to play along?" "Because you are the heir to this family, Ethan," Richard said, his voice unyielding. "And the Whitmans are critical to our business. This marriage is as much a partnership as it is a union." Ethan let out a dry chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "So, it's a transaction. Fantastic. Clearly, love has no place here." "Don't be dramatic," Eleanor said, her tone softening slightly. "You're not being asked to love her, just to respect her and fulfill your duty." "My duty?" Ethan's hands clenched into fists on the table. "My duty to marry a stranger? To give up any chance of choosing my own future? You'll have everything you need, and so will she," Richard said evenly. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I don't need this," he said, his voice low but simmering with anger. "I don't need her." "You'll meet her tomorrow," Eleanor said, rising to her feet with an air of finality. "And I expect you to behave like the man we raised you to be." Ethan stared at his mother, his jaw tight. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and strode out of the dining room, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. In his private suite, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey, the golden liquid shimmering in the light of the city skyline visible through the massive window. He downed the drink in one gulp, the burn doing little to dull the sharp edge of his frustration. "Tomorrow," he thought bitterly, "I'll meet Sophia and see what kind of game they're playing." But one thing was certain, Ethan Matthews wasn't going to make it easy for anyone. The next evening, Ethan found himself standing in the grand sitting room of the Matthews mansion, his expression carefully neutral despite the turmoil simmering beneath the surface. His parents were already seated, impeccably dressed and composed, as if this was just another business negotiation. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, his mind racing with irritation and curiosity. This was it, the moment he'd meet the mysterious Sophia Whitman, the woman his family deemed worthy of binding their fortunes together. The soft sound of approaching footsteps on polished marble floors drew his attention. He straightened instinctively, his eyes flicking toward the doorway. Then, she appeared. Sophia Whitman entered the room with the kind of poise and grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Her figure was draped in a flowing ivory gown that exuded understated elegance, and a long veil cascaded from the crown of her head to her shoulders, concealing all but the striking gray eyes that met his. They were sharp, bright, and impossibly calm, like a winter sky that saw through every facade. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe. "This is Sophia," his mother announced warmly, gesturing toward her. "Sophia, meet Ethan." Sophia inclined her head slightly, her movements fluid and composed. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, each word measured as if she was weighing its significance. Ethan hesitated before extending his hand automatically. "Likewise," he managed, though the lack of conviction in his voice was hard to ignore. His gaze flicked back to the veil. It was there, lingering like an unspoken question between them, and it gnawed at his nerves. As they settled at the dining table, the atmosphere was polite but strained. Their parents exchanged pleasantries, discussing family histories and business ventures, while Ethan's attention remained stubbornly fixed on Sophia. He couldn't look away from the veil, from the way it concealed so much yet revealed nothing. Was she hiding something? Or was this veil just another tactic in this meticulously staged charade? Midway through dinner, his irritation boiled over. Setting his fork down, Ethan turned to her, his tone low but pointed. "You don't have to keep that on, you know. No one here is going to judge you." His mother shot him a warning glance, but Sophia remained composed. Her gray eyes met his steadily, betraying no hint of unease. "I appreciate your concern," she replied calmly, her voice unwavering, "but I prefer to keep it on." "Why?" Ethan pressed, his frustration seeping into his words. "Are you hiding something?" "Ethan," Eleanor interjected sharply, her tone laced with disapproval. "It's fine," Sophia said, her tone cool and unbothered. She turned back to Ethan, her gaze direct. "I'm not hiding anything that matters." Her words stung, though Ethan couldn't quite pinpoint why. "What's under the veil is irrelevant to our arrangement," she added, her composure unshaken. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing over his chest. "Arrangement," he echoed, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "That's an interesting word for marriage." Sophia tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Isn't that what this is? An arrangement? Your parents need an alliance, and my family does as well. There's no need to complicate it with unnecessary emotions or expectations." Her calm, matter-of-fact response landed like a slap. Ethan opened his mouth to argue but found himself at a loss for words. She was so composed, so unfazed, and it unnerved him. How could someone step into a situation like this with such indifference? "I want to know who I'm marrying," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less firm. "Not just your name or your family. I want to know you." Sophia regarded him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful but guarded. "You will," she said simply. "In time. But for now, all you need to know is that I understand my role in this union. I hope you'll understand yours." Her words struck a nerve Ethan hadn't realized was exposed. Before he could respond, Sophia's father cleared his throat, breaking the tension with a suggestion about dessert. The conversation shifted, but the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken questions and unresolved emotions. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan walked Sophia and her father to the door, his frustration bubbling just below the surface. He watched as she paused at the threshold, her hand resting lightly on the frame. "Why do you act like this doesn't matter?" he asked, his voice quieter now but no less intense. Sophia turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "It matters," she said softly, "but not in the way you think." With that, she stepped into the night, leaving Ethan standing there, his frustration mingling with a flicker of curiosity he couldn't quite shake. Before I dive deeper into this fascinating story of unexpected connections and transformative journeys, I want to hear from you, my incredible viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever been captivated by someone who challenged your assumptions about them, hit that like button, because this story is only just beginning. The day of the wedding arrived with all the grandeur and extravagance one might expect from the union of two wealthy families. The Matthews estate was transformed into a scene straight out of a fairy tale, adorned with cascading flowers, crystal chandeliers, and luxurious fabrics that shimmered under the soft glow of candlelight. Guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, their conversations a blend of polite compliments and curious speculation. All eyes occasionally darted toward the grand entrance. Waiting for the bride to appear, Ethan stood at the altar, his posture rigid, his expression betraying the storm of emotions brewing within him. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as he stared ahead. To the guests, he looked every bit the poised groom, but inside, he felt like a pawn on a chessboard. This wasn't a celebration of love. It was a meticulously orchestrated transaction. The music shifted, signaling the arrival of the bride. A hush fell over the crowd as Sophia appeared, walking gracefully down the aisle, her figure swathed in an ornate white gown that sparkled with subtle embellishments. The veil, long and flowing, still concealed her face, drawing more than a few murmurs from the audience. Whispers flitted among the guests like wind through trees. Why hadn't she revealed her face yet? What was she hiding? Ethan's jaw tightened as Sophia reached the altar, standing opposite him. For a moment, he felt a surge of defiance, a desire to walk away from the ceremony and shatter the carefully constructed illusion. But the weight of his family's expectations and the calculating stares of the Whitman patriarchs bore down on him, forcing him to remain rooted in place. The officiant began the ceremony, his warm, practiced voice reciting words that felt hollow to Ethan. Vows were exchanged with precision. Rings slipped onto fingers with mechanical detachment. When the moment came for the officiant to pronounce them husband and wife, Ethan braced himself. "You may now kiss the bride," the man announced, his tone brimming with artificial cheer. Sophia inclined her head slightly but made no move to lift her veil. Ethan hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line before he leaned forward, placing a brief kiss on the fabric that separated them. The room erupted into polite applause, but the tension was palpable. The whispers only grew louder as the couple walked back down the aisle together, their union sealed yet strangely distant. The reception that followed was a lavish affair. The grand ballroom was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Yet, despite the opulence, Ethan felt disconnected from the celebration. He sat at the head table next to Sophia, their proximity doing little to bridge the chasm between them. Guests approached them with polite congratulations, but Ethan could feel their curiosity, their subtle glances at Sophia's veil. He sipped his drink in silence, his gaze occasionally drifting to her. She remained poised and composed, answering questions with measured politeness, her tone devoid of unnecessary emotion. It infuriated him, her ability to remain so calm, so unbothered by the whispers and speculation that swirled around her. As the evening wore on, Ethan's irritation festered. He couldn't ignore the whispers any longer. "Why won't she take it off?" he overheard someone murmur. "Maybe there's something wrong." His grip on his glass tightened, the shame and frustration bubbling to the surface. He turned to Sophia, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Do you even care what people are saying about you?" he asked, his tone edged with frustration. Sophia looked at him, her expression calm but impenetrable. "Their opinions are theirs to keep," she replied simply, before turning her attention back to a guest who had come to greet them. Her indifference stung more than Ethan cared to admit. He excused himself from the table shortly after, retreating to the quiet sanctuary of the balcony. The cool night air did little to soothe his simmering emotions. He stared out over the estate's manicured gardens, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of resentment, confusion, and something he couldn't quite name. Later that night, Ethan and Sophia were escorted to their private suite. The tension between them was palpable as the door closed softly behind them. Ethan shrugged off his jacket and tossed it onto a nearby chair, his frustration boiling over. "Are you planning to keep that thing on forever?" he asked, gesturing toward her veil. Sophia calmly removed her gloves, placing them neatly on the dresser. "Until I'm ready," she said evenly. Ethan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Ready? For what? To reveal whatever it is you're hiding? Or are you just enjoying this game?" Sophia turned to face him, her gray eyes meeting his through the fabric of the veil. "This isn't a game, Ethan," she said softly, "and I'm not hiding anything that matters. Not to you, maybe," he shot back. "But I'm the one standing there while people whisper about my wife like she's some sort of mystery. Do you have any idea what that's like?" Her gaze didn't waver. "If their opinions matter more to you than I do," she said quietly, "then perhaps you should reconsider what this marriage is about." Her words hit like a slap, silencing Ethan's retort. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I just want to know the truth," he said finally, his voice quieter. "Why won't you let me see you?" "When the time is right," she replied simply, turning away to sit at the vanity. The silence that followed was heavy, unyielding. Ethan poured himself another drink from the sweets bar, the alcohol burning his throat as he swallowed. "Fine," he muttered, his voice clipped. "Keep your secrets, but don't expect me to wait forever." Sophia didn't respond. She sat in quiet reflection, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Ethan retreated to the opposite side of the suite, the distance between them as vast as ever. Yet, as the night wore on and the initial sting of his anger faded, Ethan found himself wondering, not for the first time, what lay beneath the veil, not just physically, but emotionally. The days following the wedding passed in a strange blur of silence and formality. Ethan and Sophia moved through the vast Matthews estate like strangers sharing the same space but existing in entirely separate worlds. Their interactions were polite but distant, their conversations clipped and transactional. Ethan spent most of his time holed up in his office or escaping on long drives, leaving the mansion's suffocating atmosphere behind. Yet, no matter how far he went, the mystery of Sophia lingered, an ever-present weight in the back of his mind. Sophia, for her part, adapted seamlessly to her new surroundings. She carried herself with the same unflappable composure that had defined her from the start. Whether it was overseeing household staff or attending to the minutiae of her new role as Mrs. Matthews, she moved with quiet authority and grace. Ethan often found himself observing her from a distance, unable to reconcile the enigmatic woman before him with the bride he had begrudgingly married. One afternoon, Ethan wandered into the sunlit conservatory, seeking a moment of peace. He stopped short when he saw Sophia seated near the window, her posture relaxed as she sipped tea. She was speaking softly with one of the housekeepers, her tone warm and conversational. The older woman laughed at something Sophia said, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan caught a glimpse of something unfamiliar, a sense of genuine connection, untainted by pretense or obligation. It unnerved him. He had been so quick to judge her as cold and detached. Yet here she was, earning the trust and affection of those around her with ease. The contradiction gnawed at him, adding another layer to the growing puzzle of who Sophia really was. That evening, Ethan found himself in the library, scanning the rows of books for something to occupy his restless mind. He paused when he heard the soft rustle of fabric behind him. Turning, he saw Sophia standing near the shelves, her gloved hand skimming the spines of old classics. She glanced up, meeting his gaze briefly before pulling a book from the shelf. "Do you read much?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. It wasn't a challenge, just a simple question. Ethan hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Not as much as I'd like," he admitted. "Lately," I've been too busy. Sophia offered a small nod, as if she understood more than he had said. Reading helps, she murmured. It quiets the noise. Her words lingered in the air, strangely intimate. Before Ethan could think of a reply, she turned and left the room, her veil trailing softly behind her. For the first time, he felt a flicker of curiosity that wasn't laced with frustration, a genuine desire to understand her. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Ethan began noticing Sophia's subtle kindness in her interactions with the staff, the way she remembered small details about their lives and offered thoughtful gestures that made them smile. She wasn't the aloof figure he had imagined her to be. Instead, she seemed to navigate the world with a quiet strength that intrigued him despite himself. Late one evening, Ethan returned home after a particularly frustrating meeting. As he stepped into the grand hallway, he heard the faint sound of music drifting from the sitting room. He followed it, stopping just outside the door. Through the crack, he saw Sophia seated at the piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with emotion that caught him off guard. She played with an intensity that seemed to bare her soul, and for a moment, Ethan felt like an intruder in her private world. He stepped back, retreating to his room without making his presence known. But the image of her at the piano stayed with him, chipping away at the walls he had built around his assumptions. Who was this woman? And why did she continue to hide behind the veil when everything else about her seemed so deliberate, so purposeful? The distance between them persisted, but something had shifted. Ethan found himself watching her more closely, not out of suspicion but out of a growing need to understand. Each small interaction added another piece to the puzzle: her thoughtful responses to his parents' questions, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, and the rare moments when her voice softened, hinting at a depth of emotion she rarely revealed. Ethan didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was clear: Sophia Whitman was not what she seemed, and for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure that was a bad thing. Ethan had always prided himself on being a man who understood people quickly. In his world of high-stakes deals and calculated alliances, reading others was a skill he had perfected. But Sophia defied every instinct he had. The more he tried to pin her down, the more she seemed to slip through his grasp, leaving him with nothing but questions. Slowly, almost against his will, those questions began to morph into something else: curiosity. One morning, Ethan stepped into the kitchen earlier than usual. Drawn by the aroma of freshly baked pastries, he stopped in his tracks when he saw Sophia standing near the counter. Her posture relaxed as she spoke with the head cook. Her veil remained in place, but there was something unguarded about her presence that caught him off guard. She laughed softly at something Mrs. Hale said, her gloved hands gesturing animatedly. The sound was light, genuine, and utterly unexpected. "You've truly outdone yourself with these, Mrs. Hale," Sophia said, her tone warm and sincere. "They look almost too perfect to eat." Mrs. Hale beamed with pride, her cheeks flushing. "You flatter me, Mrs. Matthews. But thank you. It means a lot coming from you." Sophia reached for a plate, her movements graceful. "It's no flattery, just honesty. You've set the bar incredibly high." Ethan lingered in the doorway, unnoticed, watching the interaction unfold. It was the first time he had seen Sophia engage so openly with someone, and the ease with which she did so unsettled him. He had assumed she was distant, guarded, maybe even indifferent, but here she was, building connections effortlessly. It left him wondering why she seemed so different with him. Later that day, Ethan passed the study on his way to the terrace and paused when he noticed the door ajar. Inside, Sophia sat at the large oak desk, her head bent over a book. Her fingers trailed along the page as she read, pausing occasionally to jot down notes in a small leather journal. Her focus was unwavering, her movements deliberate. She looked like someone entirely at home in the moment, absorbed in a world of her own making. Something about the scene struck Ethan. She wasn't just reading passively. She was analyzing, learning, absorbing. He had always thought of her as a figure shrouded in mystery, defined by the veil she wore. But this was different. This was a glimpse into who she might truly be: intelligent, deliberate, and deeply engaged. Do you often spy on people? Sophia's voice broke through his thoughts. Calm but pointed. She hadn't looked up, but her words made it clear she knew he was there. Caught off guard, Ethan stepped into the room, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I wasn't spying, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Just passing by. Sophia finally looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. And yet, here you are. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it held a quiet challenge that made Ethan shift uncomfortably. What are you reading? He asked, changing the subject. Sophia closed the book, her hand resting lightly on the cover. Something about finding clarity in chaos, she replied simply. A concept I imagine you're familiar with. Ethan chuckled softly, surprised by her subtle wit. You could say that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy but not hostile, filled with unspoken questions and tentative intrigue. Finally, Sophia stood, slipping the journal into the pocket of her dress. If you'll excuse me, I have things to attend to. As she walked past him, Ethan found himself wanting to stop her, to ask her more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he watched her disappear down the hall, leaving him with the growing realization that she was far more complicated than he had imagined. That evening, Ethan returned to the sitting room where the grand piano sat unused for years. He paused in the doorway when he saw Sophia seated at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. The melody she played was soft at first, building into something hauntingly beautiful. It was raw and emotional, a stark contrast to the poised composure she wore like armor. He leaned against the wall, letting the music wash over him. For the first time, he saw a crack in her exterior, a glimpse of vulnerability that made her seem achingly human. He didn't interrupt her, didn't make his presence known. Instead, he listened until the final note faded into silence, leaving a lingering sense of something unspoken between them. As he walked back to his room that night, Ethan couldn't shake the image of her at the piano, the quiet intensity in her music. It was as if she had let down her guard for a moment, allowing him to see a part of her she kept hidden from the world. And for the first time, he found himself wanting to know more, not because of the mystery surrounding her veil, but because of the woman she was beneath it. One late morning, Ethan sat in his study, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows casting a golden glow over the stacks of papers cluttering his desk. The tension in his shoulders was palpable as he leaned over a set of merger documents. Frustration etched across his face. Numbers swam before his eyes, and every attempt to make sense of the stalled deal felt like hitting another dead end. He rubbed his temples, letting out a sharp sigh. The Matthews-Whitman partnership, the very reason he'd been pushed into this marriage, now teetered on the brink of collapse. He didn't hear Sophia approach until her voice cut softly through the stillness. Do you need help? Ethan looked up, startled to see her standing in the doorway. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, her posture composed as always, and her veil, as ever, obscured her face. His first instinct was to brush her off, to remind her that business was his domain. I don't think this is your area of expertise, he said, his tone sharper than intended. Sophia stepped further into the room, unfazed by his dismissal. Perhaps not, she replied evenly. But sometimes a fresh perspective can help. Ethan hesitated, then leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Be my guest, he said dryly, gesturing to the papers scattered across the desk. Sophia moved closer, her gloved hands skimming over the documents. She paused over one section, her head tilting slightly as she read. This clause, she said after a moment, tapping the page lightly. It's too vague. The language leaves room for interpretation, and that's likely what's making them hesitate. Ethan frowned, leaning forward to follow her gaze. You think that's the issue? I don't think, Sophia said with quiet confidence. I know. Tighten the language. Eliminate the ambiguity. And give them something concrete to trust. They'll sign. Her words hung in the air as Ethan stared at her, the weight of her suggestion sinking in. She wasn't guessing, she was certain. Against his better judgment, he found himself nodding. All right, he said slowly, reaching for a pen. Let's see if you're right. He made the adjustments, sent the revised document to his legal team, and tried not to dwell on the possibility that Sophia had just solved a problem that had been plaguing him for weeks. But later that afternoon, when the confirmation email arrived announcing that the other party had agreed to move forward, Ethan couldn't deny the truth. She was right. That evening, he found Sophia in the conservatory, tending to the vibrant array of flowers that filled the space with their subtle fragrance. She didn't look up when he entered, but he knew she was aware of his presence. For a moment, he simply watched her, the delicate way her hands moved among the blooms, her calm energy filling the room. It was a stark contrast to the chaos she had just helped him navigate. You were right, Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. Sophia turned slightly, her head tilting in acknowledgement. About the merger? Yes, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. I didn't think it was possible, but you saw what I didn't. Sophia turned fully now, her gray eyes meeting his through the veil. Sometimes the solution is simpler than we think, she said, her voice calm but not condescending. We just need to step back and see it clearly. Her words hit him harder than he cared to admit. Ethan had spent so much time resenting her presence, convinced that she was nothing more than a pawn in their family's schemes. But in that moment, he saw something else, an ally, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge him, to point out his blind spots, and to stand by her observations with quiet conviction. Thank you, he said, the words coming out more sincerely than he'd expected. Sophia inclined her head. You're welcome, she replied simply, before turning back to the flowers. Ethan lingered for a moment longer, a strange mix of gratitude and curiosity swirling in his chest. She hadn't demanded recognition or sought to prove herself. She had simply seen a problem and offered a solution. It was such a stark contrast to the calculated power plays he was used to, and it left him feeling unmoored. As he walked back to his office, Ethan found himself replaying the interaction in his mind. Sophia wasn't what he had expected. In fact, she was nothing like he had imagined, and for the first time, he began to wonder if the woman behind the veil might be far more extraordinary than he'd ever given her credit for. A week later, the Matthews family received an invitation to a high-profile charity gala hosted by the Whitmans. The event was set to raise funds for a local children's hospital, a cause close to the Whitman family's heart. Ethan initially had no intention of attending. The idea of parading his marriage in front of a room full of judgmental eyes felt unbearable. But his parents insisted. To his surprise, Sophia spoke up as well, her calm voice cutting through his reluctance. I think it's important we go, she said simply, her tone leaving no room for argument. It's an opportunity to show unity, not just for the families, but for the cause. Ethan couldn't argue with that, though he secretly doubted her motives. Was this just another stage for her to play the role of the perfect bride? Veiled and untouchable? Still, curiosity, and a growing respect for her quiet determination, nudged him to agree. The evening of the gala arrived, and the grand ballroom of the Whitman estate sparkled under an ocean of crystal chandeliers. Guests dressed in their finest attire filled the space, exchanging pleasantries and admiring the carefully curated decor. Ethan entered with Sophia on his arm, her poise as impeccable as ever. She wore a deep emerald gown that seemed to flow like water with her every step, her veil a delicate contrast that only heightened the air of mystery surrounding her. As they made their way through the room, Ethan couldn't help but notice the reactions she garnered. People whispered, their curiosity palpable. But Sophia remained unfazed. She greeted each guest with grace, her voice steady and polite, leaving even the most skeptical onlookers disarmed. Ethan, who had been prepared for an uncomfortable evening, found himself oddly intrigued by the effect she had on the crowd. Midway through the evening, a commotion near the silent auction table caught Ethan's attention. A technical issue had disrupted the digital bidding system, leaving the organizers scrambling. Ethan watched as Sophia quietly stepped forward, her demeanor calm as she addressed the volunteers. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the tablet. The staff hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. Sophia scanned the screen quickly, her gloved fingers moving with precision as she navigated the system. Within moments, she had identified the problem and implemented a solution. When the screen refreshed and the bids began flowing again, a round of relieved applause broke out among the organizers. Ethan, standing a few steps away, felt a strange swell of pride. He hadn't expected her to involve herself so directly, let alone solve the issue with such quiet confidence. She didn't bask in the recognition, instead offering a few encouraging words to the volunteers before rejoining him. "You didn't have to do that," he said as she approached. "It needed to be done," she replied simply. "And it wasn't difficult." Her modesty caught him off guard. "Still," he said, glancing around at the approving smiles from the other guests, "you made an impression." Sophia turned her head slightly, her gray eyes meeting his through the veil. "That's not why I did it," she said softly. "The focus should be on the cause, not us." The sincerity in her voice left him momentarily speechless. For the first time, he realized she wasn't just playing a role in this marriage. She genuinely cared about the people around her, about making a difference. It was a quality he hadn't expected, and it unsettled him in the best way possible. Later that evening, during the main address, Ethan found himself standing beside Sophia on the grand stage as his father delivered a speech about the importance of unity and giving back. As Richard Matthews spoke, Ethan couldn't help but glance at Sophia, who stood quietly at his side. Her presence was steady, unshakable, and he found himself wondering how she managed to carry herself with such grace amid the constant scrutiny. When the evening finally came to a close, Ethan and Sophia lingered on the estate's sweeping terrace, overlooking the twinkling city lights below. The cool night air carried a peaceful stillness, a welcome contrast to the bustling energy of the gala. "You surprised me tonight," Ethan admitted, his voice softer than usual. Sophia turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable beneath the veil. "How so?" "You didn't just show up, you made a difference," he said. "I didn't expect that." Sophia's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe you should stop expecting things, Ethan. People are often more than they appear." Her words lingered in the air between them, filled with an unspoken challenge. Ethan felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name: admiration, curiosity, perhaps even a hint of regret for how he had dismissed her before. For the first time, he wondered if this marriage, this partnership, could become something far more meaningful than either of them had anticipated. Later that night, the house was quiet, with only the soft hum of the wind brushing against the windows. Ethan found himself in the sitting room, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the crackling fire. The events of the evening played over in his mind, Sophia stepping in to fix the auction, the calm confidence with which she handled herself, the subtle but undeniable respect she had earned from the guests. He couldn't shake the image of her standing on that stage beside him, poised and purposeful, her presence commanding attention without ever demanding it. He didn't hear her enter until she spoke. "You look deep in thought." Ethan turned to see Sophia standing in the doorway, her figure illuminated by the flickering firelight. She was still in her emerald gown, the veil trailing delicately over her shoulders. Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as though she wasn't sure if she was intruding. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan admitted, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. "Join me?" Sophia hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and taking the seat. The firelight danced on her veil, creating a strange, almost ethereal effect. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that felt heavy but not uncomfortable, as if both were waiting for the other to speak first. "You surprised me tonight," Ethan said finally, breaking the quiet. His tone was free of sarcasm, carrying an honesty that surprised even him. "At the gala, the way you handled everything, it was impressive." Sophia tilted her head slightly, her gray eyes meeting his through the veil. "I thought it was important to do what I could," she said simply. "Events like that aren't just about appearances. They're about creating real impact." Ethan nodded, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I didn't expect you to care so much about the cause, the people. You've always seemed detached." Sophia's gaze didn't waver. "Because I don't show my face?" He hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "Partly," he admitted. "But it's more than that. You keep so much of yourself hidden. It's hard to know what's real." Her lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Perhaps it's not about what's hidden, Ethan. Perhaps it's about what you choose to see." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan frowned, leaning forward slightly. "And what am I supposed to see?" Sophia turned her head toward the fire, her profile illuminated by the warm glow. "That there's more to people than what they show on the surface. That worth isn't defined by what's immediately visible." She paused, her voice softening. "I've learned that lesson the hard way." Ethan's curiosity deepened, his frustration giving way to something gentler, more genuine. "What do you mean?" Sophia was quiet for a moment, as though deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "People are quick to judge, Ethan. They see what they want to see, make assumptions, and draw conclusions without ever looking deeper. I've experienced that my entire life. The veil, it's not about hiding. It's about shifting the focus, forcing people to see beyond the surface." Her words struck something deep within him. He thought of all the assumptions he had made about her, all the ways he had tried to define her without ever truly understanding her. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and undeniable. "I've been one of those people, haven't I?" he said quietly. Sophia turned back to him, her gray eyes soft but unwavering. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But the question is, Ethan, are you willing to see beyond what's easy?" Her question lingered, a quiet challenge that cut through the defenses he had spent years building. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of his own biases, the narrow lens through which he had viewed her. And for the first time, he wanted to change. "I want to try," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "I want to understand you, not just as the woman I married, but as the person you are." Sophia's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something vulnerable behind the veil. "Then we start here," she said simply, "with honesty and patience." Ethan nodded, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I can do that." For the rest of the night, they spoke quietly, sharing pieces of themselves they had never thought to offer before. The distance between them began to shrink, not through grand gestures but through the quiet, steady rhythm of connection. Ethan found himself listening to her stories, her insights, her reflections, and with each word, he felt his understanding of her and himself shift. The days after their quiet conversation by the fire marked a subtle but undeniable shift in Ethan's relationship with Sophia. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no sweeping gestures or sudden declarations, but the walls between them began to crack. Ethan found himself noticing more about her, not just the mystery of her veil, but the thoughtful way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her voice, and the moments of kindness she offered without expecting anything in return. And yet, even as his respect for her deepened, so did his frustration with himself. How could he have been so blind to the person she truly was? The tension between them reached its peak during a formal dinner hosted at the Matthews estate for business associates and family friends. The dining hall was a symphony of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and subdued conversation. Ethan sat at the head of the table, Sophia at his side, her veil as present as ever. As the evening progressed, the whispers began, hushed but sharp, like knives slicing through the air. "She still hasn't taken it off," someone murmured. "Perhaps she's hiding something. A scar. Maybe." Another voice suggested. Ethan clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the stem of his glass. He glanced at Sophia, expecting to see some sign of discomfort, but she remained poised, her movements measured as she reached for her water. It was as though she hadn't heard a word, or perhaps she had simply grown used to it. The final straw came when one guest, emboldened by a few too many glasses of wine, leaned forward with a smirk. "So, Mrs. Matthews, are you planning to reveal your face anytime soon? Or is the mystery part of the allure?" A ripple of awkward laughter spread through the room. Ethan felt his chest tighten, a flash of anger coursing through him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sophia spoke first. "I see no reason why my appearance should matter to anyone here," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. Her gaze, sharp and piercing even through the veil, swept across the table. "Surely, the value of this evening lies in the conversation and company, not in superficial curiosities." The room fell silent, the guest shrinking back in his seat. Ethan watched as Sophia resumed eating, her composure intact, but he could sense the weight of the moment pressing on her. For the first time, he realized how much strength it took for her to endure this constant scrutiny, how much grace it required to deflect it without breaking. As the dinner ended and the guests began to disperse, Ethan found himself pulling Sophia aside in the quiet of the garden. The moon cast a soft glow over the neatly trimmed hedges, and the distant hum of conversation faded into the night. "You didn't have to handle that alone," he said, his voice low but firm. "I should have said something." Sophia turned to face him, her expression unreadable beneath the veil. "Why would you? They weren't attacking you." "That doesn't mean I shouldn't defend you," Ethan countered, frustration lacing his words. "I'm your husband." Are you?" she interrupted, her tone sharper than he had ever heard it. "Because until now, you've seemed more like a silent observer, watching from a distance while I navigate this alone." Her words hit him like a blow, cutting through his pride and defenses. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softer now. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been distant. I've let my own doubts and frustrations cloud everything. But I see you now, Sophia. I see how strong you are, how much you carry. And I hate that I've made it harder for you." Sophia's gaze softened, though she remained guarded. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" "I want to be better," he said simply. "For you. For us." Sophia turned away, her hands clasped in front of her as she stared out at the garden. "Words are easy, Ethan. Actions are harder." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "Then let me prove it." The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A week later, during another public event, the whispers started again. This time, Ethan didn't hesitate. When a guest made a snide remark about Sophia's veil, he stood, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "If anyone here believes that a person's value is determined by their appearance, then you have no place in this conversation," he said firmly, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "My wife's intelligence, grace, and strength speak for themselves. If you're too shallow to see that, then perhaps it's time you left." The room fell silent, shock rippling through the guests. Sophia, standing at his side, looked up at him, her gray eyes wide with surprise. For the first time, Ethan didn't care about the opinions of others. He cared only about showing Sophia that she mattered, that he saw her for who she truly was. Later that evening, as they returned home, Sophia paused at the bottom of the grand staircase. Ethan stopped beside her. Waiting, she turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. "Why did you do that?" "Because you deserve it," he said simply. "You deserve to be seen, not just by them, but by me. And I'm sorry it's taken me this long to realize that. Sophia was silent for a long moment before nodding. Thank you, she said softly. That meant more than you know. As she ascended the stairs, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The walls between them weren't gone, but they were crumbling, and for the first time, he felt certain they could build something stronger in their place. The days after their quiet conversation by the fire marked a subtle but undeniable shift in Ethan's relationship with Sophia. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no sweeping gestures or sudden declarations, but the walls between them began to crack. Ethan found himself noticing more about her. Not just the mystery of her veil, but the thoughtful way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her voice, and the moments of kindness she offered without expecting anything in return. And yet, even as his respect for her deepened, so did his frustration with himself. How could he have been so blind to the person she truly was? The tension between them reached its peak during a formal dinner hosted at the Matthews estate for business associates and family friends. The dining hall was a symphony of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and subdued conversation. Ethan sat at the head of the table, Sophia at his side, her veil as present as ever. As the evening progressed, the whispers began, hushed but sharp, like knives slicing through the air. She still hasn't taken it off, someone murmured. Perhaps she's hiding something, a scar, maybe. Another voice suggested. Ethan clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the stem of his glass. He glanced at Sophia, expecting to see some sign of discomfort, but she remained poised, her movements measured as she reached for her water. It was as though she hadn't heard a word, or perhaps she had simply grown used to it. The final straw came when one guest, emboldened by a few too many glasses of wine, leaned forward with a smirk. So, Mrs. Matthews, are you planning to reveal your face anytime soon? Or is the mystery part of the allure? A ripple of awkward laughter spread through the room. Ethan felt his chest tighten, a flash of anger coursing through him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sophia spoke first. I see no reason why my appearance should matter to anyone here, she said, her voice calm but unyielding. Her gaze, sharp and piercing even through the veil, swept across the table. Surely, the value of this evening lies in the conversation and company, not in superficial curiosities. The room fell silent, the guest shrinking back in his seat. Ethan watched as Sophia resumed eating, her composure intact, but he could sense the weight of the moment pressing on her. For the first time, he realized how much strength it took for her to endure this constant scrutiny, how much grace it required to deflect it without breaking. As the dinner ended and the guests began to disperse, Ethan found himself pulling Sophia aside in the quiet of the garden. The moon cast a soft glow over the neatly trimmed hedges, and the distant hum of conversation faded into the night. You didn't have to handle that alone, he said, his voice low but firm. I should have said something. Sophia turned to face him, her expression unreadable beneath the veil. Why would you? They weren't attacking you. That doesn't mean I shouldn't defend you, Ethan countered, frustration lacing his words. I'm your husband. Are you? She interrupted, her tone sharper than he had ever heard it. Because until now, you've seemed more like a silent observer, watching from a distance while I navigate this alone. Her words hit him like a blow, cutting through his pride and defenses. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softer now. You're right, he admitted. I've been distant. I've let my own doubts and frustrations cloud everything. But I see you now, Sophia. I see how strong you are, how much you carry. And I hate that I've made it harder for you. Sophia's gaze softened, though she remained guarded. What do you want from me, Ethan? I want to be better, he said simply. For you, for us. Sophia turned away, her hands clasped in front of her as she stared out at the garden. Words are easy, Ethan. Actions are harder. Ethan nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. Then let me prove it. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A week later, during another public event, the whispers started again. This time, Ethan didn't hesitate. When a guest made a snide remark about Sophia's veil, he stood, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. If anyone here believes that a person's value is determined by their appearance, then you have no place in this conversation, he said firmly, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. My wife's intelligence, grace, and strength speak for themselves. If you're too shallow to see that, then perhaps it's time you left. The room fell silent, shock rippling through the guests. Sophia, standing at his side, looked up at him, her gray eyes wide with surprise. For the first time, Ethan didn't care about the opinions of others. He cared only about showing Sophia that she mattered, that he saw her for who she truly was. Later that evening, as they returned home, Sophia paused at the bottom of the grand staircase. Ethan stopped beside her. Waiting, she turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. Why did you do that? Because you deserve it, he said simply. You deserve to be seen, not just by them, but by me. And I'm sorry it's taken me this long to realize that. Sophia was silent for a long moment before nodding. Thank you, she said softly. That meant more than you know. As she ascended the stairs, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The walls between them weren't gone, but they were crumbling, and for the first time, he felt certain they could build something stronger in their place. The following days were quieter, but something had undeniably shifted between Ethan and Sophia. Their interactions, once stilted and formal, began to soften. Ethan found himself seeking her company, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to understand her. Sophia, in turn, seemed more willing to engage, her words carrying a subtle warmth that had been absent before. Yet, even as their bond grew, Ethan could sense that the veil still served as a barrier, a final line of defense that Sophia wasn't ready to lower. One evening, as they sat together in the library, the rain tapping softly against the windows, Ethan decided to broach the subject that had lingered unspoken between them for so long. Sophia was seated across from him, a book resting in her lap, her posture as composed as ever. Sophia, he began, his voice breaking the quiet. I need to ask you something. She looked up, her gray eyes meeting his through the veil. What is it? He hesitated, searching for the right words. Your veil, it's more than just privacy, isn't it? It's a choice, something deeper. Sophia closed her book slowly, her gloved hands resting on the cover. Yes, she said softly. It is. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Then help me understand. Why do you wear it? Why do you keep this part of yourself hidden? Sophia's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers tightening slightly around the book. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Ethan wondered if he had pushed too far. But then she exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as she looked back up at him. I wear it because I've spent most of my life being judged for things I couldn't control, she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. My family's wealth, my appearance, my name. People saw those things and assumed they knew who I was. They never looked deeper. They never cared to. She paused, her hands loosening their grip. The veil became a way to shift the narrative, to make people see me for who I am, not for what they expect me to be. Ethan's chest tightened as her words sank in. He thought of all the assumptions he had made about her, the way he had let his frustration blind him to her complexity. And what about me? He asked quietly. Did you think I'd only see the surface? Sophia tilted her head slightly, her gray eyes searching his. At first, yes, she admitted. But you've surprised me, Ethan. You've shown me that you're capable of more, that you're willing to look beyond what's easy. Her honesty left him momentarily speechless. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a soft sigh. I want to prove that I'm worthy of that trust, he said finally. But I also want to see all of you, Sophia, not just who you are behind the veil. but the person who wears it. Sophia's expression softened, and for the first time, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "When the time is right," she said softly. "I promise, Ethan. But for now, this is who I am." Ethan nodded, his chest tight but his resolve stronger than ever. "I can wait," he said, "for as long as you need." The conversation left a quiet understanding between them, a sense of trust that hadn't been there before. And while the veil remained, it no longer felt like an insurmountable barrier. Instead, it became a symbol of something deeper, a connection built not on appearances, but on the courage to see and be seen. The weeks that followed brought Ethan and Sophia closer in ways neither of them had anticipated. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, as they began to share pieces of themselves that had once been guarded. Ethan found himself seeking her opinion on business matters, not just as a courtesy, but because he valued her insights. Sophia, in turn, began to let down her emotional walls, revealing glimpses of a sharp wit and a quiet humor that caught him off guard and left him wanting more. But the world around them didn't slow down. The Matthews and Whitman families were preparing for the annual Whitman Foundation Gala, an event that drew some of the most influential figures in their circles. This time, however, the pressure felt different. Ethan no longer dreaded the idea of attending with Sophia. Instead, he was determined to stand by her side, not as a distant partner, but as someone who had come to admire her strength and grace. The night of the gala arrived with all the opulence one might expect. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers. Tables were adorned with fresh flowers and gold-trimmed linens, and a symphony played softly in the background. Guests milled about in designer gowns and sharp tuxedos, exchanging pleasantries and speculative glances. Ethan and Sophia arrived together, their entrance drawing immediate attention. Sophia wore a flowing silver gown that shimmered under the lights, her veil once again in place. But this time, Ethan felt no discomfort, no frustration. Instead, he felt pride. As they moved through the crowd, he noticed the way people gravitated toward her, drawn to her calm confidence and measured words. Even behind the veil, she commanded respect in a way that left no room for doubt. At the height of the evening, the Whitman patriarch took to the stage to deliver a speech about the foundation's work. He spoke passionately about their efforts to support underprivileged children and called for continued generosity from the attendees. As he stepped down, the host approached Ethan and Sophia, inviting them to say a few words as representatives of the Matthews family. Ethan felt a flicker of unease but quickly pushed it aside. He turned to Sophia, who nodded almost imperceptibly, her gray eyes steady and encouraging. Together, they ascended the stage, the room falling silent as all eyes turned to them. Ethan began, his voice strong and clear. He spoke about the importance of the cause, about the power of collective action, and about the legacy of compassion that events like these sought to build. As he spoke, he glanced at Sophia, drawing strength from her quiet presence beside him. When he finished, the room erupted into polite applause, but instead of stepping down, Ethan paused, turning to Sophia. "And now," he said, his voice softening but carrying across the room, "I'd like to invite my wife, Sophia, to share her thoughts." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Sophia stepped forward. For a brief moment, Ethan saw hesitation flicker in her posture, but it was gone just as quickly. She lifted her head, her voice calm and steady as she began to speak. "I'm honored to stand here tonight," she said, her words carrying a quiet strength that silenced the murmurs. "Not just as a representative of the Matthews family, but as someone who deeply believes in the importance of what we're doing here. When we strip away the surface, the titles, the wealth, the appearances, we're left with one simple truth. The power to help others is what defines us." Her words hung in the air, resonating with a sincerity that was impossible to ignore. For the first time, Ethan saw the room not as a collection of judgmental onlookers, but as individuals who were captivated by Sophia's authenticity. As the applause swelled, Ethan stepped closer to her, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his through the veil. And in that moment, he knew. It wasn't just admiration or respect. It was love, quiet, unassuming, but undeniable. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but the memory of that moment stayed with Ethan. Later, as they returned to the quiet of their home, he turned to Sophia in the dimly lit entryway. "You were incredible tonight," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Sophia paused, her gloved hands resting lightly on the banister. "I only said what needed to be said." "No," Ethan said, stepping closer. "You said what only you could say. You made them listen. You made me listen." Sophia looked up at him, her expression unreadable beneath the veil. "And what did you hear, Ethan?" He took a deep breath, his voice steady. "I heard the truth, that you're stronger than anyone I've ever met, that you've been teaching me how to see the world differently, even when I didn't realize it, and that I'm the luckiest man alive to be standing here with you." For a long moment, Sophia said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached out, her gloved hand brushing against his. "You're starting to see, Ethan," she said softly. "That's all I ever wanted." Ethan clasped her hand gently, his heart pounding. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt certain they would face it together. The morning after the gala, Ethan awoke with an unusual sense of clarity. The memories of Sophia's speech, her strength, and the quiet but powerful way she had captivated the room lingered in his mind like a warm glow. For the first time, he felt an overwhelming desire to truly know her, to bridge the gap that still existed between them. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a yearning to connect with the woman who had turned his life upside down in the most unexpected ways. As the sun streamed through the large windows of their shared breakfast nook, Ethan found Sophia already seated at the table, a cup of tea in her hands. The veil, as always, was in place, but today it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like an invitation, a challenge to look beyond what he could see. "Good morning," he said, taking a seat across from her. "Good morning," she replied, her voice calm but carrying a trace of warmth that hadn't been there before. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then decided to speak the thoughts that had been circling his mind since the night before. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about stripping away the surface and focusing on what truly matters." Sophia tilted her head slightly, her gray eyes meeting his. "And I realized I've been so focused on what I couldn't see that I've been blind to what's been right in front of me this whole time," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "You've shown me that strength isn't about being loud or forceful. It's about grace, resilience, and the courage to hold your ground, even when the world demands otherwise." Sophia set her cup down, her hands folding neatly on the table. "That's a kind observation, Ethan. But strength isn't just mine to claim. You've shown your own in ways you may not realize." Ethan frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but steady. "You've faced your own assumptions, your own doubts, and chosen to confront them. That takes courage, Ethan. And it's why we're able to have this conversation now." Her words struck him deeply, but before he could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was one of the household staff, informing them of an unexpected visit from the Whitman patriarch. Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophia, curiosity flickering in his eyes. When they entered the formal sitting room, Mr. Whitman stood by the fireplace, his posture as commanding as ever. His sharp gaze swept over the couple as they approached, but it softened slightly when it landed on Sophia. "Good morning," Mr. Whitman said, his voice carrying the weight of years of authority. "I wanted to personally thank you both for your contributions last night. The gala was a resounding success, and I've received countless messages about the speech." Sophia inclined her head gracefully. "I'm glad it resonated." "It did more than resonate," Mr. Whitman continued, his tone almost fatherly. "You reminded people of what truly matters, and in doing so, you elevated the reputation of both our families." Ethan felt a swell of pride at the acknowledgement. But what struck him most was the subtle affection in Mr. Whitman's voice when he addressed Sophia. It wasn't just respect, it was admiration. As the conversation continued, Ethan found himself stepping back slightly, letting Sophia take the lead. She spoke with a quiet authority that commanded attention, her insights thoughtful and precise. Watching her, Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for her, for the chance to stand beside her, and for the way she had begun to transform not just their marriage, but his understanding of himself. Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Ethan approached Sophia in the library. She was seated by the window, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over her figure. "Can I join you?" he asked. Sophia looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment before she nodded. "Of course." He took the seat beside her. The silence between them filled with a newfound comfort. For a while, neither spoke, the unspoken connection enough. Then, after a long pause, Ethan turned to her. "Sophia," he said, his voice careful but earnest. "I know I've said this before, but I want you to know how much you've changed the way I see things. How much you've changed me." Sophia's gaze softened, and though the veil hid her expression, Ethan thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile in her eyes. "You've changed too, Ethan," she said quietly, "and that's what makes this work." They sat there, side by side, the weight of their journey resting lightly between them. For the first time, Ethan felt that the veil was no longer a wall. It was a part of their story, one they were writing together. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Ethan and Sophia continued to grow. Their conversations deepened, their shared moments became more natural, and the weight of unspoken tension began to lift. Ethan found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated, not just because of her intelligence and grace, but because of the way she challenged him to see the world and himself differently. But even as their relationship flourished, the veil remained, a silent reminder of the distance that still existed between them. Ethan no longer saw it as a barrier, but he couldn't deny the lingering desire to fully know the woman he had come to care for so deeply. Yet, he chose to wait, understanding that her decision to remove it would come only when she was ready. One afternoon, as they walked through the sprawling gardens of the estate, Ethan found the courage to broach the subject once more. The late spring sun cast dappled shadows on the path, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. Sophia walked beside him, her posture as poised as ever, her veil gently swaying in the breeze. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," Ethan began, his tone careful but direct. Sophia glanced at him, her gray eyes calm. "Go on." Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The veil. I've come to respect why you wear it. I understand the strength it represents for you. But I also wonder, will there ever come a time when you'll take it off? When you'll let me see all of you?" Sophia stopped walking, turning to face him fully. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. Then she spoke, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "Ethan, it's not about whether I trust you. I do, more than you know. But taking off the veil isn't just about you. It's about me. It's about letting go of the protection it's given me, the identity it's allowed me to build on my own terms." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening at the vulnerability in her words. "I understand," he said softly, "and I'll wait, as long as it takes." Sophia's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something deeper behind the veil. A gratitude, perhaps, or even affection. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than I can say." As they continued their walk, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent so much of his life focused on appearances, on the expectations of others. But Sophia had shown him a different way. She had taught him the value of patience, of seeing beyond the surface, and of building something real from the ground up. Their journey took another unexpected turn a few days later. when the Matthews and Whitman families convened for a private dinner to discuss a major business expansion. The room was filled with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the weight of high-stakes decisions. Ethan and Sophia sat side by side, their presence a united front. As the discussion grew more intense, it was Sophia who broke through the noise. She leaned forward, her voice calm but commanding, as she offered a perspective no one else had considered. If the goal is long-term sustainability, she said, then the focus should be on building partnerships that prioritize mutual growth, not just immediate profit. A short-term win is meaningless if it undermines future opportunities. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Even the most seasoned executives seemed taken aback by her insight. Ethan watched as respect flickered across the faces of those around the table, and a swell of pride rose in his chest. This was Sophia, unwavering, brilliant, and unafraid to speak her truth. After the meeting, as the guests began to depart, Ethan lingered in the doorway with Sophia by his side. His father approached, his expression thoughtful. "She's remarkable, you know," Richard said, nodding toward Sophia. "You're lucky to have her." Ethan glanced at Sophia, his heart swelling. "I know," he replied, "and I don't take that for granted." That night, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens, Ethan turned to Sophia with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" he asked, his voice quiet. "You could have said no." Sophia tilted her head, considering his question. "Because I saw potential," she said finally. "In this partnership, yes, but also in you. I believed you were capable of more than you realized." Ethan's throat tightened at her words. "And have I lived up to that?" Sophia's eyes met his, her gaze steady. "You're getting there," she said, a faint smile in her voice. Ethan couldn't help but laugh softly, the tension in his chest easing. "Well, I'm not done yet." Sophia's lips curved into a small smile, and for the first time, Ethan felt like they were truly on the same page. Not just as partners in a union arranged by others, but as two people building something real. The following weeks were filled with a quiet, steady rhythm of change. Ethan and Sophia's partnership deepened as they began to navigate not just the demands of their families, but the nuances of their growing relationship. What had once felt like an obligation now felt like a choice, a decision to build something meaningful together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the estate in hues of gold and amber, Ethan found himself walking to the conservatory where Sophia often retreated. He paused in the doorway, watching her as she moved among the plants, her touch gentle and deliberate. The soft light framed her figure, her veil catching the last rays of sunlight. "You're hiding away again," he teased lightly, stepping into the room. Sophia turned, her eyes meeting his with a faint glimmer of amusement. "Not hiding," she corrected. "Thinking." Ethan smiled, crossing the room to stand beside her. "About anything in particular?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting to the rows of vibrant blooms. "About what it means to belong somewhere," she said softly. "To feel at home." Ethan felt his chest tighten at the vulnerability in her voice. "Do you feel that here?" he asked, his tone careful. Sophia looked at him, her expression unreadable behind the veil. "I'm starting to," she admitted. "But belonging isn't just about a place. It's about people. Connections." Ethan nodded, her words settling deep within him. "You belong here, Sophia," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Not because of this house or our families, but because of who you are. And I want you to know that." Sophia's gaze softened, and though she didn't speak, Ethan felt the weight of her acknowledgement in the way she looked at him. It was a small moment, but it carried more meaning than he could have anticipated. The turning point came on a night that neither of them could have predicted. A storm had rolled in, rain pounding against the windows as lightning illuminated the sky. Ethan was in his study, reviewing a proposal, when Sophia appeared at the door. Her presence was unexpected but welcome. "Am I interrupting?" she asked. Ethan set the papers aside, motioning for her to come in. "Not at all. What's on your mind?" Sophia stepped inside, her movements deliberate. She held a small, ornate box in her hands, its surface intricately carved. She placed it on the desk between them, her gray eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "This belonged to my mother," she said quietly. "She used it to keep things that mattered to her, things she didn't want the world to see." Ethan's gaze shifted to the box. His curiosity piqued. "What's inside?" Sophia hesitated, her fingers brushing lightly over the lid. "Pieces of her story," she said. "And now, pieces of mine." Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding. "Why are you showing this to me?" "Because I think you're ready to understand," she said simply. Sophia opened the box, revealing a collection of small, carefully preserved items. A faded photograph of a young woman with striking gray eyes, a delicate piece of jewelry, a handwritten letter folded with care. Each piece told a story, and as Sophia began to explain their significance, Ethan listened intently, his heart breaking and mending in equal measure. She spoke of her mother's struggles, of the judgments they had faced, and of the lessons she had learned about resilience and self-worth. She shared her fears, her hopes, and the reasons she had chosen to wear the veil not as a shield, but as a symbol of her decision to define herself on her own terms. By the time she finished, the storm outside had subsided, leaving a heavy stillness in its wake. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at her, the weight of her story settling over him like a tangible thing. "Sophia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know if I can ever fully understand what you've been through, but I want you to know this. I see you, not just the woman you've shown me, but all of you, and I'm so incredibly grateful that you've let me in." Sophia's eyes shimmered, and for the first time, Ethan saw her reach for the edge of her veil. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she was testing the strength of the moment. When she finally pulled it back, Ethan's breath caught. She was beautiful not just in the way the world defined beauty, but in the way her strength, vulnerability, and grace radiated from her. Her gray eyes met his, filled with a mixture of hope and fear. As though she was bracing for what he might say, Ethan stepped forward, his hand reaching out to gently cup her face. "You're extraordinary," he said softly. "Every part of you." Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The moment felt infinite, a culmination of everything they had endured and everything they had become. And as they stood there, the storm outside giving way to a quiet dawn, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had found their way to each other, not through perfection or pretense, but through the courage to see and be seen. Final chapter, a new beginning. A year had passed, and the lives of Ethan and Sophia had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The veil that once symbolized distance was now a memory, not a barrier, but a testament to the journey they had taken together. Sophia had become an integral part of the Matthews family, respected and admired not only for her intelligence but also for her compassion and authenticity. Ethan, once bound by expectations and assumptions, had grown into a man who embraced vulnerability and strength with equal measure. That morning, sunlight poured into the shared workspace they had created, casting a warm glow on the wooden desk strewn with papers and notes. Ethan was engrossed in reviewing the details of their latest joint project, a charity initiative aimed at providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children. It was an idea Sophia had proposed months earlier, one that had grown into a shared passion. Across from him, Sophia was meticulously editing a speech Ethan would deliver later that week. Her gloved hand moved steadily across the page, her attention to detail unwavering. "Here," she said, tapping a line in the draft. "If you emphasize the long-term impact of this program, it'll resonate more strongly." Ethan looked up and smiled. "You're not just brilliant, you're always right," he said, his tone teasing but sincere. "I don't know how I managed before you." Sophia laughed softly, the warmth in her eyes shining through. "You would have found a way," she replied. "But together, we can do so much more." Their moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. One of the staff entered, announcing that a journalist from a prestigious business magazine had arrived to interview them about the project. Ethan and Sophia exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. This would be the first time they presented themselves publicly, not just as a couple but as equal partners in a shared vision. The interview was conducted in a cozy, sunlit room adorned with fresh flowers. The journalist, a young woman with a warm demeanor, began with questions about their work. Ethan spoke with his usual confidence, outlining the program's goals and aspirations. But as the conversation shifted to its heart and purpose, he turned to Sophia, signaling for her to share her perspective. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her tone calm and measured. "This initiative is about more than just providing resources," she said. "It's about giving people the tools to define their own futures, to rise above circumstances and create lasting change. That's the real legacy we hope to build." The journalist nodded, clearly impressed, but then her expression softened as she asked, "Sophia, your journey has been unique, especially your decision to keep your identity private for so long. Would you be willing to share more about that?" Sophia paused, her gray eyes meeting Ethan's. He gave her a subtle nod, his gaze steady and reassuring. Taking a deep breath, Sophia spoke. "For much of my life, people judged me for things I couldn't control: my family's name, our wealth, even my appearance." She began. "The veil was never about hiding. It was about shifting the focus, challenging others to look beyond the surface and see the person I truly am. It was a way to reclaim my narrative, to remind people that value isn't skin deep." Her words hung in the air, filled with a quiet power that left even the journalist momentarily speechless. Ethan watched her with admiration, his chest swelling with pride. This was Sophia, not just his wife, but a woman of unparalleled strength and conviction. After the interview, as they stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, Ethan turned to Sophia. "You were extraordinary," he said, his voice full of emotion. Sophia looked at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I only spoke the truth," she replied. "But thank you for standing by me." Ethan reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining as they walked together. "You've taught me so much," he said, "about seeing beyond what's easy, about being patient, and about building something real." Sophia stopped and turned to face him fully, her gaze soft but intent. "And you've shown me that trust isn't given, it's earned. That partnership isn't about perfection, but about showing up for each other, even when it's hard." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "So, where do we go from here?" Sophia tilted her head, her gray eyes sparkling. "Wherever we want," she said simply. Together, in that moment, standing hand in hand beneath the wide, open sky, Ethan and Sophia knew that their story wasn't about where they started, but about the journey they had taken to get here. Their love, forged in adversity and nurtured through trust, had grown into something unshakable. If you've ever believed in the transformative power of love and trust, share your story in the comments below. And if Ethan and Sophia's journey inspired you, hit that like button, because while this chapter of their story comes to a close, their legacy of hope and courage will live on.